Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
It's with great privilege I get to introduce Liz Goodman, who is coming to give us a talk today. This is a talk in a slightly different fashion than many of the talks that we host here. Liz is a designer. She is at the Information School at the University of California, Berkeley, which is where I graduated from. She has a sort of funny background of things, starting off at Yale, doing all sorts of fun with social theory, and then going to the interactive telecommunication program at NYU, thinking about how you actually build and design and move through systems. For a while, she actually worked at Intel, which is a very different corporate culture here, and at the same time extremely technical. So she's spent a lot of time actually thinking about the ways in which you can actually intersect between engineers and developers and designers. And so she's going to talk today about designing for urban green space. The one thing I want to sort of set the tone for ahead of time is that unlike more mathematically focused talks where there is a strong linear narrative through the talk, design talks spend a lot of time taking a topic and working around it in loops. So in other words, if you don't understand something on the first slide, it's not that you will miss the rest of the talk. So as a result, and this is primarily targeted at Christian, as a result, the thing I'm going to ask everybody to do is to actually really hold off on their questions. Liz has done a pretty good job of giving signposts of when questions are really appropriate so they can get into conversation about this. And so if you have absolutely something burning for clarification, go ahead and ask, but please resist the temptation to, if you don't understand. All right, come on, you two are off on this planet.
I just wanted to know if you arranged for Jennifer.
To make certain that the talker Joe. Yeah, but we still have Christian. You know, if we were working on the arrangement, we would have sent him off too. But without further ado, have fun.
Fantastic. So Damon did a wonderful introduction. So can you guys see me over this computer screen? Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask everybody to ignore the fact that I've got this. I was going to try and conceal the fact that I was going to read some of this, but whatever. We're all friends here. This is my talk. And I'll just stand out here and try and cover the room with some attention. So despite this picture, it's not actually a talk about bicycles. If you're disappointed, you can leave now. Instead, it's a talk about why the bicycles are there and how those people got there, which is this stuff, the grass. And as Dana said, I'm a PhD student here at the University of California, Berkeley. My background is in interaction design, and I did a lot of research on what's been called urban computing, which is computing specifically for city life, which tries to take into account kind of density, mobility, kind of geography of cities. As I go on and I move closer and closer to being a cultural geographer in some ways at heart. And what I try and do in designing for cities is investigate people's dreams, chores, habits, love, hates, and kind of translate that into design decisions that can inform future products and services. I try not to limit that kind of informing of design, though, to seeing myself as kind of instrumentally operationalizing literal recommendations. So I try not to say, gosh, joggers run around a lot, maybe we should make a mobile device that you can wear on their shorts. Well, that's a totally interesting and reasonable thing to say. What I often do, and what I want to do in this talk, is use social research to inform design strategy, to map out agendas for larger technology programs, and try to, as clearly as I can, instantiate concerns about human life, human existence in those agendas in a way that's hopefully not too abstract, not too general, but also not too tied to those jogging shorts in a way. And I'm hoping then that you can take this talk, for all the theoretical physicists and computer scientists in the room, both as a call to action in terms of designing for and with urban green space, but also as a kind of exemplar of this sort of talk, of this genre of talk from someone like me with this background. And think about, no, I'm not going to say you should do your own talks differently, but as Dana said, this is not going to be the kind of logical one thing moves to another talk. Instead, I'm going to try and map out different areas of concern. And so I want to begin with one big point. When I first started doing research on green space, a lot of people thought I was crazy. And like, wow, where's the information systems in green space? There's no digital life in green space. It's natural, right? And I realized that was because green space, in sort of the way we talk about new technologies and services, often shows up as a way to sell computers. So here's the pretty green space, and here's the laptop that the guy's working on. And the green space here basically functions as a replacement for a cubicle, right? It kind of motivates why you might want to buy a Centrino laptop. Yeah, I did work for Intel. But A, green space isn't just parks, and B, designing for green space isn't just about designing for laptops. And so what I want to do is start, like a good researcher, by defining what I mean by green space. Actually, you know what? Does anyone have a question? I will take one question now. Just one. Okay.
What was that building in front of the company land picture for?
Good question. Exactly. Scarcity breeds a negotiation about what's important. One question. That is my department. This is the School of Information, this beautiful Victorian building. The School of Information. It is called South Hall. And there's an urban legend. That was two questions. You're right. Next.
No, it was one question. You didn't answer it.
I think you asked it ambiguously enough that I had a choice and I made it. So, just to be clear here, when I say, I'm going back to my talk, just to be clear, when I say urban green space, I don't mean just parks. And this is a kind of category system that I use to think about green space. It's not the only way you could think about urban green space. For all purposes, it's not even the best way. But for my purposes, to get purchase on this set of ways of thinking about design, I think about urban green space in terms of ownership and access, i.e., who owns the land, and can I visit it? Can I get in? Can I pick the flowers? Can I walk on the grass? Because that, in many ways, is the way in which we colloquially talk about or see urban green space, the fenced-in park, etc. And so, so on the top left, we have public lands that are kind of visible and accessible. And these urban jewels, like Boston Commons, Golden Gate Park, they're part of what you might see as the tourist resources of a city. They're really photographed. They're very well known. They're kind of iconic in some ways, often of the cities that they belong to, like Central Park. Then you also have things like what I call local spots. So this is a little median in Berkeley off a sidewalk that has been repurposed by picnickers, by a farmer's market to use. It has no visibility outside of Berkeley, but everyone can access it. And if you walk past on a Sunday or Saturday, it's a really nice place to eat a sandwich. Down here, we have this idea of private property, which anyone can access. And here are these planters, right? They don't belong to me. They belong to that building back there. If I wanted to mess around with them, let's be clear here. If I wanted to install a sensor system that measured air quality in downtown San Francisco, I'd have to actually ask the building manager, or I'd get in a lot of trouble. That's kind of one way of thinking about what I call street sites. You can see them, but you can't touch them. And then, sort of on the other side from these, we have what I call secret gardens. Secret gardens are your backyard, maybe a little window box full of herbs, things that are privately owned and basically inaccessible. These, by the way, are in my back garden. And I want to be clear, from my perspective, potted plants are urban green space too. They clean the air. You can grow things to eat in them. You know, just because an urban green space seems like a very small green space, as you can see throughout this talk, I'm going to insist that they are all part of ecological networks. And that's why I include the tiny pots too. So I want to highlight the idea here as a kind of conceptual resource, drawing on cultural geography, that green space is not natural. It's not nature. I mean, even nothing's really nature, you know. Wilderness parks only exist because the United States set up separate areas for wilderness. Otherwise, we might be grazing cattle on them. This idea of untamed nature is often a little dicey, and I try to avoid it. This, if you've noticed, the San Francisco Historical Photo Collection, is Golden Gate Park in the early 19th century. It doesn't look much like a park, does it? It actually was sand dunes for most of its life. That's what the Golden Gate Park was before it was turned into this beautiful, green, iconic gem through decades and decades of intensive city investment to pay for the plants, to pay for the labor. Without that city investment, it would either have remained sand dunes or maybe it would just have been city streets like the rest of San Francisco. So it's hard to say then that even something as seemingly lush and green and verdant as the Golden Gate Park is natural. We know we made it. We humans designed it and constructed it. And as with all things that we design and build, it's... you mean what was? That's a good question. I'd say it's a statement. I don't think you can define urban green space through its non-naturalness, or if you did, that would not be perhaps the most meaningful way to define it. I'd say not natural is a way to kind of counteract the argument people make that where they naturalize all the decisions that went into making something like this picture of Central Park. And what I want to do here is start us thinking about the way in which this non-natural space is produced through intention with other issues like politics, like economics, like immigration, let's say. And public parks in particular are often stages for discussions, for kind of often very agonizing discussions about leisure, about work, about citizenship, about inclusion. This picture of young girls can tell us a lot about early 20th century New York. You know, this public is not rioting as people did in early 20th century New York. They're not drunk as people often were in early 20th century New York. This kind of classic kind of publicity picture of young girls shows them as educated children from a public school, dressed in nice dresses, dancing, and it, I would argue, represents this place of education and socialization of children into a kind of way of life. And as a design question then, looking at this photo, what I like to do is think about then the ideas of the public, or the ideas of visitors that I then bring into parks or other green spaces. Whose public is the park? Who can visit? Is it a place for rowdy teenagers? Is it a place for people to sleep? Is it a place for people to, oh, I don't know, drink beer on a lovely summer day? Those questions are negotiated and you can actually be thrown out if you don't adhere to them. And so I'd ask you guys how you imagine the public that the parks belong to, and what kinds of hopes and fears you might have for your city, your state, your region, in thinking about designing for futures. And given that urban green spaces, I'm arguing, are kind of produced in some ways and are produced by the conditions of urban life, crowding, immigration, 9 to 5 or maybe, oh, I don't know, 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. jobs, as happened in early 20th century sometimes. Green spaces and their forms change. And this is, to me, a really interesting example of how we can imagine green space as a technology of urban living, as a way to remake urban spaces. This is a housing development near Madrid, and it's a new development. Madrid is, as you might know, a very dry place, and it had no trees, right? They built this whole thing out of nothing. And until the trees go in, the public plazas are going to be really unpleasant. You can't air condition them. And so what the developers did is propose this thing called air trees, which makes these giant structures filled with green potted plants, essentially large potted plants, that through kind of respiration and what's the word, photosynthesis, are actually providing shade, lowering the temperature inside, making it a little cooler, and doing what you would expect a nice grove of trees to do. And they actually also have solar panels to provide power for public performances and music at night. And what's interesting is that as soon as these trees go in, the developers are planning to remove this because it's served its job as a tree replacement, and they'll essentially then leave a clearing in the forest. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that this is the most optimal design solution to that challenge. But what I want to suggest here is that greenery is a technology that you can deploy in different ways and that you can think of as integrating with the built environment in different ways. This is kind of a really clever engineering response. And that also the craft of working with green space is the craft of thinking in decades. You know, it's a great way to think long term and to plan to support certain kinds of institutions, to think about the resources that would require, like the kind of terraforming of Central Park over many, many years. Why would you do that? Well, I honestly could spend about 3 hours just talking about why you might want to think hard about that kind of long-term investment in urban green spaces. And I'm just not going to go through all of this. But I do want to point out that I've made some kind of artificial categories here between neighborhood stability and public health and environmental remediation in terms of thinking about green spaces as technology. And that's because one intervention can actually have sort of multiple effects on multiple communities. So if you think about a community garden, I think some people here saw my talk about community gardens yesterday. A community garden can help build social cohesion, help build kind of shared experiences and relationships between neighbors who don't know each other. It can thus perhaps helping them work towards other neighborhood goals. It can help with environmental runoff. It can sort of help do stormwater management, which overloads sewage systems. It can also help ensure food stability and food security for for homeless shelters who depend on donations. It can be a learning experience for children, so you can have after-school programs. It can provide habitat for local wildlife, and on and on and on. And so in some ways, if I were going to really diagram this out, it would be this kind of big, messy network of interconnected factors that are affecting each other. And that, I think, is the most interesting thing about green space, is that it's part of these very messy interconnected networks, and that one intervention in public space can sort of touch all these different aspects. And because of that, they're really hard, which is another reason why I think green spaces are fascinating, is that they're a good, hard, challenging problem if you think about kind of complexity. And of all places, the Virginia Department of Forestry outlined some lovely opportunities for intervening in that space. And by opportunities, they mean hard things. So I just want to go through kind of quickly some of the really interesting challenges, needs, activities that I see designers as having particular insights into. And so, first of all, you have this idea of awareness. If you remember what I said about secret gardens or about kind of hidden spaces, how do people know that there's anything there to help out with, to work on? Complexity. Looking at this picture of a community garden, the number of institutional actors required to keep it going is actually quite large. It seems like a very simple space, but you actually have water and power utilities, you have trash collection, you have the local neighborhood groups who had to be corralled into managing the thing, you had various quarrelsome local nonprofits who squabbled over who should run the entire network of gardens, and then you have, of course, all of these neighbors who are trying to coordinate their activities, right? And I'll tell you right now, everything runs on email. Everything runs on long chains of email lists. And then you get to, and why is it so complex? Well, because gardens have to be maintained. You know, it's not like, I don't know, this podium, which will just continue being a podium until it kind of disintegrates after 300 years if you put it outside. If you don't take care of a garden, it's no longer a garden. It will go back to being a kind of overgrown empty lot. Or alternately, some developer will buy it and then there'll be condos there. But in any case, the kind of continuous investment of labor is a really interesting problem because it means that you can't just assume things will go well if the group stops coordinating. And finally, costs. It's expensive. It's expensive in time. It's expensive in some money. It's expensive in effort in terms of thinking about all that maintenance and then coordinating these complex groups. All right, here's another opportunity for questions before I move on to the next. You can have more than one question this time. All right.
I have a question sort of about Boston,
Mm-hmm.
but I've noticed this trend of kind of like, especially like playgrounds, having a toddler, that there's things announcing, you know, new playgrounds here and there, and they have this plunk down effect where purposes are siloed. This is a sitting area, and over here is a playground area, and it seems like the opposite of what you want in good planning, like seats around a sandbox that invites people to both look after their kids and talk rather than having to stand and then go sit. I wondered what is going on with that. Is that cheaper to do, easier, takes less thought, or just?
It's actually, so there's if you're interested, I recommend a wonderful book by the historian Galen Krantz called The Politics of Park Design, which kind of periodicizes 4 periods in kind of agendas of park design or shared notions about how one ought to organize space. And she would probably link that back to what's called the progressive park, which is this sort of 30s idea of everything in its place. And you know, that depends on kind of how you categorize the everything into different groups. And so a normal kind of categorization might be kids, young kids here, slightly older kids here, slightly older kids here, adults, you know what I mean? Here's the sports area, here's the kids area. And you know, we can go into why that was and what the characteristic kind of tendencies of that organizational principle are, but what comes out of it are these kind of hard boundaries between where one thinks different groups will be. And you'll see that in a lot of parks, particularly neighborhood parks. It's like, oh God, we couldn't possibly have the dogs next to the kids. You know, the people have concerns about the mixing, let's say, of disparate groups that then get instrumentalized in fences or walls or gates or big signs saying that you can't go in without a kid, which is another way of kind of making that division. Yes?
Can I ask a very basic question? So you have this polar coordinate like what's green space, and it seems to be so broad that I'm getting a sense of, so what is not green space? What's that?
Most classrooms. Most classrooms.
Yes. Yes. In a sense, I think that's what we struggle with all the time. I've tried to kind of limit it a little bit, but it's kind of like, if you've ever tried to do a design project on, so I once did a design project on online dating, I'll just pick that. And suddenly everything looks like a facet of online dating, of relationship building, of trust, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to acknowledge that these boundaries are drawn a tad bit arbitrarily, and in general, don't hit me too hard on this, I have very simple ways of thinking about green space. I'm a very simple person. Is there a plant? Yes, no. Even though I'll say that that's a bit too simple, if we need to draw some limits, that's a good place to start. I might argue that this is in a way the difference between a designerly talk and a scientific talk, is that from a designerly perspective, what I want to do is get purchase on the problem in order to advance an initial solution. And that's what I'm doing here. Yes?
So when you say urban green space, would suburban green space be in the same general category or more like rural green space?
That's a really good question. And would suburban green space be included in that? And I'd argue that right now I'm implicitly pointing to suburban green space as well. If you think about metropolitan regions as kind of aggregates, right? You have a chunk of space that we would think of as being urban, right? It's denser, it's more built up, and then that sort of fades into something we might call suburban. And then there's some sort of messy areas, and you've got this sort of, let's say, multi-nucleated regional core in which there are lots of kind of things that feel like urban spaces and things that feel like suburban spaces. I'm going to say that I think the suburbs are really different in some ways than the kind of classic urban spaces I've talked about. But if you wanted to, you could lump both of them together in opposition to rural areas with more open space for farming. Does that help? All right, I'm going to go on. It's great. We might find that I actually run out of slides before we run out of time. So this is kind of where I want to transition into 3 ways to think about designing for and with this sort of messy construct that we're going to call urban green space. And I'm going to try and move from lesser to greater kind of organizational complexity and scope. And each time I sort of move through one of these different ways, I'm going to use some examples of products and services that do those things. A, because it's easier if we get more specific, and B, because I want to remind everyone that this is not theoretical, right? That this is actual working products that people have invested time and money in right now that are being used. And getting back to my problem when people kept coming up to me and saying, "Where's the digital information in urban green spaces?" This is my answer. She said, "It's still there. It's right there." So I want to start with this idea of expertise. It's kind of a personal idea. Like, how do you, or me, Liz, how do I figure out how to keep a plant alive? Right? I'm not very good at it. And education and this idea of educating around gardening has actually prompted a lot of really interesting design work, because that seems to be the basic problem for many people, right? You'd like to work in a community garden, you'd like to fix up your backyard, but you don't actually know how. And many of us didn't come from rural places, so nobody ever showed us as a young person. The other problem is that if you move even from state to state or regions within states, environmental information, what you might think of as weather, soil conditions, the tendency of plants to grow well or not, is really local. It's in fact micro-local. It can get down to hillside, valley. If you're in California, it can really differ between I don't know, from yard to yard, depending on where you are on a hillside. And so even people who think they know how to grow plants may find that if they move to a new city, they're just totally lost. And so Easy Bloom tried to solve that problem by hooking up a soil sensor to a plant database. And it kind of instantiates the knowledge of the expert in this little flower thing. The other sort of idea is that, well, you need help knowing when your plant needs water. And I realize to those of you who are good at growing things, the idea that you would need a wireless sensor to tell you that your plant needs water sounds really silly. And for those of you who have black thumbs and can't grow anything, you might be going like, yeah, it's just what I need. But they're both trying to deal with that kind of this maintenance idea. And then you have this much sort of wider idea of myfolia.com, which tries to make the expertise problem social and communal by creating these kind of networks of friendships and these sort of object-centered networks of tomato growers, where everyone contributes a little bit of local information, thus building up a database of relatively detailed, geographically specific instructions and tips for not just starting but continuing. And the idea, ideally, is that MyFolia would kind of cover every city and every place so that if you moved to a new place, you would be able to get your little printout from other people like you who have grown things about what you could grow. Thus actually kind of obviating Easy Bloom's business model, but, well, different ways of handling the same problem. Other people have tried to think about the idea of cultivation less as a kind of personal action and much more as an idea of creating networks or of perhaps sharing access. Remember I talked about like what can you get access to, whose flowers can you pick. And another really interesting category of services and products that I've been following are things that, terrible pun, cultivate networks of fruit production, of vegetable production. So fallen fruit is very low tech. I don't know, has anyone seen it? Yeah, I mean it comes from the basic intuition that most people have more fruit than they can personally eat. Most people have more fruit than maybe their family wants to eat. The web is good for connecting people who don't know each other around shared activities. Why don't we just map all the fruit trees that have too much fruit that are publicly accessible, and then you can, well, do what you want with them. This is a slightly more overt way of dealing with the same problem. A bunch of Londoners decided that they were sick of what we might call abandoned street sites. Planters or other spaces that were publicly owned or owned by corporations which had fallen into disrepair. It was ugly, it didn't match their idea of what they wanted for their lives, and instead of trying to, get permission first the way I might, they just went in at night and took it over. The idea being is that if you go in and plant things at night and then run, no one will actually be too angry. And sure enough, they've been it's been spreading from London where it started around the world. And there are quite a few groups of people who will go in at night, change everything, and then get someone who lives nearby to handle maintenance. There is a website too. And then this is one of my favorite ones, Landshare, which in a sense tries to take guerrilla gardening to a slightly more legalized level, in which the BBC has created a service that will match up kind of want land, got land relationships. And essentially they have created a structure within which people can negotiate individually how and where they would like other people to cultivate land that they own. And once again, this is the sort of thing that if you know someone, like I know Dana, I can personally invite Dana to garden in my backyard, and that's fine. What I think is interesting is the way in which the institution of the BBC, a trusted British institution, has intervened as a broker to mediate these relationships essentially between strangers and make them a little safer and more organized. And you can see that it's quite complex, actually. There are growers, landowners, land spotters, facilitators. So they're actually trying to bring in lots of people who want very different things out of this idea of land cultivation. And that, I think, is a really interesting kind of long-term network creating mechanism, because they're trying to figure out what all of the different roles and interests people could have and play. I.e., you're not just a gardener. Maybe you don't want to garden. Maybe you're just interested in walking around the city and looking for kind of empty lots. It's that sort of thing. Then another gardening pun with this idea of fertilizing action. And this gets to, I think, one of the big ideas I'd like us to think about. It gets to sort of the problem of urban green space, right? Which is that you don't draw a fine line between urban green space and suburban green space. If you think about, or even rural green space, right? It's not like there's a wall between Boston and its suburbs that means that no ecological processes can cross over it. It's actually a continuous region. And within that continuous region, there are different political entities. One might want to work with those political entities over time in order to create more durable, more geographically broad changes. ParkScan in San Francisco is a system that allows people to register and make automatic complaints to the Parks Management Board, which sounds quite minor unless you've ever tried to make a complaint to a city government about anything. They've simply automated all of the bureaucracy for you. What they can do then is make these nice little pie charts at the end of the year of all the complaints, how many of them have been answered, how fast it took. And then they make these beautiful little reports, take them to the supervisors, and use that as evidence to, let's say, name and shame certain political entities into taking action. They can do this because, of course, they've invested in creating this system that works with the city bureaucracy to make the complaints in the first place, so that they can guarantee that they have really tried to do it the correct way. On the other hand, sometimes what you see is a kind of repurposing of data to serve political uses. These are, I don't know if you can read this, called often the $50 million photos. I realize they're not very attractive photos. It's hard to imagine how they could have cost or meant 50 million of anything. But this shows the loss of forest cover over 20 years in Washington, D.C. And the Post got a hold of them, wrote a whole, shame of the city style article about, I know, like you really can't see the loss of the, okay. Doesn't it? This is, so I will say that this is one of the most interesting things to me about this idea of using data to spark political change. So here you can see that there's more greenery, literally. And then if you look down, it's slightly oranger and blacker. It's a satellite image, I'm sorry. It's a satellite image of the Washington, D.C. area. And it's not particularly clear. Like, this does not look like $50 million to me. Yet, the Washington Post used these photos to advertise or really to illustrate a giant crusading article about the shameful loss of ground cover over the past 20 years and how terrible it was for Washington, D.C. And a very wealthy person donated $50 million to set up a new foundation to track the growth and loss of vegetation in Washington, D.C. and plant more trees on the basis of these two somewhat muddy photos. And if you locate the power in the photos, you think that's crazy. This doesn't say anything. If, however, you think about the influence of the Washington Post in setting priorities for discussion and changing people's opinion, then suddenly the characteristics, the kind of visible attributes of the photos seem a lot less important. And what's more interesting is the way in which an institution like the Post can point to these scientific satellite photos as a rhetorical resource. I call them charismatic images, even though they aren't all that seemingly charismatic, because suddenly the images become a kind of icon on which this entire set of conversation hangs. One of the things we can think about environmental data sets as doing, especially environmental visualizations, is becoming charismatic images that can be used in political conversations. If you're really good, you can probably get more than 50 million these days because of inflation. And that's something we often don't think about, right? We often sort of associate the meaning with the actual photo and lose track of the way in which photos don't speak for themselves, right? I have to speak for and explain this photo. And if I forget to mention that it's a satellite photo, it's not like you're just going to know. Somebody has to speak for the data. ParkSpan has to speak for these pie charts. And last, I want to point to something that doesn't seem quite as overtly political, but is quite political. And that is the attempt to track climate change through what we might call volunteer citizen scientists. So Journey North is a educational website that tries to get kids and elementary school teachers involved in kind of basic field biology, looking for plants, looking for flowers. And what they ask kids and teachers to do is report on the website their first sight of a specific kind of swallow, or the first bloom they see after winter. Over many years, their hope is, and they've been doing this for some time, they will begin to actually create aggregate pictures of reported changes that can be more dispersed across the US than the efforts of trained scientists, right? It's just too expensive to fund human data gathering in this many points. But if a number of families and classes can do it for free, doing relatively simple things like looking for the first monarch butterfly. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to spot a monarch butterfly and send an email to this website. Suddenly you've got a kind of dispersed reporting system that can produce these, again, charismatic, perhaps, maps over time that show longitudinal change over an entire continent. And that can be very, very impressive. I don't, by the way, believe that Journey North is an environmental action group. They bill themselves as doing citizen science, just to be clear. But I think that, we know that the climate change discussion is somewhat fraught, and what they're doing is adding observational data to that discussion. So, how many people are designers, or consider themselves designers or developers in the room? All right, I have a slide for you here. Because, I've talked about ways in which we can kind of facilitate expertise. I talked about kind of connecting individual groups in terms of property, cultivation, and ownership relations. I talked about kind of creating these political or charismatic narratives and how some people and organizations become kind of spokespeople for data. And this is my stab at doing something that's in between kind of the big general concepts I've given you and the really super instrumentalized and operationalized, like jogging shorts thing. And so I'm trying to sort of think about a framework for networking green spaces. And given all of these various kind of technological ingredients, what that could look like. Was that a question? But actually, while I'm here, questions?
Much of it seems to be focused around the network of the people around around
Mhm.
the green rather than the network of the green itself.
Yes.
How is that tension worked out within the various design endeavors in this kind of space?
I would argue that most of the design endeavors have perhaps focused unduly on people. I think you're correct that there's a tension. If I'm going to describe the activities that have been happening up until now, I would say, especially commercially, I would say that most of them see relationships between people, as with Myfolia, which creates kind of gardener-based information. Actually, let's get back to Myfolia.
It seems to contradict the obsession towards sensors, where the sensors in many ways is about the relationship between the different objects and the ways in which there's a communication both historically and locally around this.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the irony of Easy Bloom is that it kind of the sensor constructs your relationship with the soil, right? It kind of takes all this data out, and then it links you to this pre-canned database, right? So the people who make this are really trying to make sure that your primary relationship is with them in some ways. I think Botanicals is interesting because they've created a Twitter feed. So you can buy this, by the way, set it up for yourself and have it Twitter reminders, which seems silly, but if you think about the plant as a center of a kind of network between people in terms of obligations, responsibilities, angry arguments over who forgot to water the plant, it makes more sense. But we're still really talking about people. I think conceptually, ironically, even though plants, non-humans, are at the center of a lot of this conversation, we still often think about kind of plants as a kind of medium for relationships between people. This starts getting a little bit interesting because they allow users to sort and search by kinds of plants. So you can maybe begin to see relationships between all of the tomato plants in Boston and how they cope with climate care, etc. Is that what you're thinking of?
Actually, because it seems as though the obsession to bring the greenery in is one, human driven, which goes back to your earlier points, but two, like the introduction of instrumentalization to it is still very much about the people, not about the relationship of the.
I think actually this might be one of those questions, Dana, that will be answered a few slides down. And this kind of actually, I think, begins to talk about this more. So as we roll into a conclusion to this talk, I want to try and think about green spaces not as individual sites, which is kind of a tendency, right? You see the beautiful garden and you think about it kind of as a landscape, sort of as a pretty picture in front of you. And if there are fences or walls, or if it's kind of bounded in concrete, you see it as a single site. And what I'd like to suggest, even thinking about some of these things like land share or Myfolia, is that you see it as part of a larger set of related sites in the same bioregion, in the same watershed, in the same food shed, in the same kind of air quality zone, and that all of those are relationships that we should probably be thinking about much more than the kind of overt, I own this, you own that, this place is walled off from that place. So one way you could think about it is in the circle, I'm going to have to read this, we see how green spaces can themselves be drawn together by introducing technical mediators and intermediaries such as sensors, like databases, like an API as an interface. You can begin to think about how green spaces as nodes, as geographically separate nodes, could be kind of drawn closer through digital networks. On the other hand, that's kind of meaningless unless you think about them also as links between various institutions and geographic regions. So if you think about, my sidewalk median, converting that sidewalk, that concrete sidewalk strip, to having a grassy edge will actually help with stormwater drainage. Or alternately, you can think about the same group that does that also using a community garden for food growing to connect them to a charity or to a local school. You can also think about the garden as a kind of work training relationship between a nonprofit and the city, et cetera. You can think about how city government uses parklands to connect to kind of regional biosphere planning issues, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a lot messier than this kind of neat technical diagram. But that's kind of the point, is that, as I said, the interesting thing about green spaces is that they're kind of messy and complicated, and they link together lots of different groups. And this sort of schematic of how green spaces could link them together is what makes the whole project meaningful, right? I mean, it doesn't really mean anything to just hook up a sensor to a plant. I mean, it could be technically cool, but I mean, what's the point? Well, maybe the point is that you would like to, what did I do? Okay. Maybe you'd like to enable groups of strangers to better take care of remote orchards, right? Orchards that's kind of hard for any one person to get to. So you use a scheduling system to schedule visits by people, right? That's what the community garden email lists do. Maybe you think about the databases that MyFolia is setting up as a way of making these more meaningful, skillful gardeners who can grow their own food. There's been a lot of talk about not just a watershed, but a food shed recently, which was a new term to me when I heard it. And it's essentially the distance that your food travels to get to you. So watershed is the distance your water travels to get to you. Food shed. So my food shed probably reaches all the way to Guatemala. Some people like to have a food shed that is no bigger than 100 miles. Some ecologists are arguing that someday in the future we will all have to have a food shed that's a lot smaller than mine is currently. Maybe even a 100-mile food shed, depending on how expensive it becomes to ship things. Food, unlike data, is always going to cost a lot to ship. And so what kinds of networks am I talking about that we could think about in regions? I just talked about the food shed. You could think about distributed urban farming, as some of America's cities, like Detroit and Philadelphia, shrink instead of grow. There's a lot of empty lots. This is a proposal by the architecture studio Front Studio to turn big chunks of Philadelphia, after soil remediation, into urban farms. Yes? Sure. So I think Detroit is the best example of this. It's had a ton of population loss over really the past 30 years, right? Detroit's heyday was very short, and since then it's been losing people. And the city, as built out in its heyday, is actually infrastructurally overbuilt. I mean, it has more houses than people can live in. It has more water pipes than people can use. It has streetlights in places that nobody lives in anymore. So one proposal for American cities has been essentially to cut their losses and try and get the population to move closer to a kind of reasonable core, to re-densify, essentially by cutting out the empty bits and moving people in. It's more or less accepted in different cities. I think Detroit and Philadelphia. Detroit is kind of the extreme edge case of that, but Philadelphia has been talking about it. A lot of the cities of the Rust Belt, sadly, in the Midwest, have had population drain.
of certain cities, of loss and other such
Yeah.
thing. There's actually been a lot of urban creation really quickly.
where there wasn't.
Right.
But that,
Yeah.
I mean, that's actually, well,
New Orleans?
New Orleans could have that. I mean, that's a really politically fraught conversation right there. You know, again, like one of the things I think is you know, I show these pretty pictures and they look really pretty, and you know, the flowers are lovely, except that the conversations are actually quite difficult, which is another reason why I'm proposing to you that this is a really interesting topic. A slightly less politically fraught small business that I've been interested in is a group called My Farm, San Francisco. And what they do is they will turn your backyard into a distributed urban farm. So they essentially grow things in your backyard, take it to a central hub, redistribute it, and what you have is the equivalent of a CSA, community supported agriculture, except that the agriculture is actually happening in various sizes of backyards around the city. What's interesting is that their plan is to take the software they use to manage their business and turn it into, kind of box it up into an open source project so that other people can replicate their business model. One assumes outside of San Francisco, otherwise they'll be somewhat sad, but they do make a profit. But what I think is interesting is the way in which they're really proposing to use urban land more efficiently. And that's another kind of sort of distributed urban production that's a lot less dramatic than this proposal for Philadelphia. And we also talked about, again, the idea of relationships between humans. And the other kinds of networks in the city are networks of non-humans. Drops of water and the network it travels through in order to get to the ocean. A network which is of pipes and tubes, which is really overburdened in storms. Sewage plus stormwater makes for, on century-old pipes, kind of a scary combination. If you think about what happened in Katrina, storms really overburden systems. One way that a lot of my examples are going to be from San Francisco. Call me parochial. But there's a lot of interesting stuff happening there. This group in San Francisco essentially tries to get homeowners and other people to strip out concrete, as much concrete as possible, replace it with drainable surfaces in order to get as much rainwater and storms back into the earth and keep it from flowing into the sewage system. I'm actually currently working with a group with the architecture department at Berkeley who's trying to look at unused city lands. So they're taking a database of city lands and how it's used, a kind of an environmental database, looking at drainage problems, urban heat management problems. Cities create a lot of heat, tree cover gaps, and is trying to figure out whether it can work with the city to combine those data sets and then kind of cleverly parameterize the designs so that they can do a kind of mass urban redesign of currently unused space to try and improve all of those kind of pressing, let's call network complexity issues like heat islands or water drainage, where the individual intentions are good, but the aggregate results for the city are really bad. You know, as with, again, thinking back to those $50 million photos of tree coverage, all the individual decisions to cut down trees or to build more suburban development seemed like a good idea, and in aggregate what they actually did is increase the temperature in Washington, D.C. by depriving it of tree cover, which, if you've been in Washington and D.C. in the summer, sounds like a terrible, terrible outcome. And the last kind of set of non-humans, or at least non-individuals, kind of networked together by green spaces and in green spaces, is institutions and groups. And the ways in which growing food or taking care of plants kind of solidify relationships and form relationships. So the city of Seattle has a food bank program where community gardens essentially register to grow and drop off a certain amount of food And what I think is interesting is the way in which it links these kind of disparate constituencies. Right? On the one hand, you have homeless shelters and food pantries and other things that, let's say the well-heeled citizens of Seattle who actually work in these community gardens might not be willing to actually volunteer at. They might not actually want to make that human connection with the food pantry by volunteering, but they'll happily grow some extra tomatoes or some extra corn or whatever and let the city shuttle the actual objects between them. And I think this kind of contractual relationship through the green space is an interesting, again, way to think about, like with land share, how we might design interventions, how we might kind of use these green spaces to broker relationships between institutions and organizations. And that's it. I had a really nice conclusion, but we're being so casual here. I think I just want to thank you for listening and ask if there are any last questions. All right, Gilad.
So, it seems like the buzzword now with green spaces is being LEED certified, having your building expose some of its percentage with some form of greenery. I wonder if you've looked at that practice and seen, first of all, I'm very skeptical about it. Sounds like carbon offsets to me, but does it actually affect people? Does it actually connect people to nature, or nature spots to other nature spots?
I mean, I think I'm kind of skeptical too, especially of anything that sounds like carbon offsetting, which I have a designer friend who made this project called Natural Fuse, which was intended to be a, light it was attached to a plant, and it would only give you the amount of light that the plant was offsetting in producing oxygen, right? Except that lights using electric lights produces so much carbon, and single plants produce so little oxygen. It was a unrealistic idea, let's say. So then he decided to multiply it, and he thought, well, I'll make a network of plants. Unfortunately, the network of plants couldn't even offset the single light bulb. And so his idea, this sort of idealistic idea, was transformed into a much more kind of complicated and nuanced thing where everybody has a light. There's a big group of plants. You can turn on your light. But if you drain all of it won't stay on for very long, and then you drain all the plants, and everybody knows that you're the one who drained all the plants. And so he eventually turned it into a piece less about kind of carbon offsetting per se, and more about collective use of limited resources and how that can be visualized.
How many people signed up for having their lights to work this way?
Well, I mean, the idea is that it's a desk lamp, right? But which is even funnier, because you're not going to put your whole house on this thing, because you don't want to risk your whole house on this uncertain, crazy system. No, you have a little desk lamp. And of course, the joke is that the desk lamp can really only be on for 5 minutes at a time before it essentially drains the entire carbon offsetting of this massive network of little plants. But that's sort of the point, is that it's a lot more complicated than we think it is. Getting back to the idea of connecting to nature, that's another thing that I'm sort of skeptical about, in the sense that nature as a concept is something that humans invent and that is constantly changing over time, because it reflects, let's say, changing priorities. So, for example, the American concept of wilderness came to be meaningful in a kind of specific time and place and for specific reasons. The valuing of wilderness is pretty recent. The Puritans thought that wilderness was an evil place filled with devils. And, and here we are 200 years later, praising the wilderness parks as, America's best idea. There's a huge gap, from the original Americans to the Americans we are now. And
the reason why I asked this is because, so these being LEED certified, which is highly appreciated, it's for the benefit of the city because it provides green spaces, right, for everyone.
Right.
It doesn't, like you said, it doesn't provide, like there's no human connection there. There's no like expertise growth. There's no call like fertilizing actions, like you said.
So I'm reluctant to say that we should only value green space in terms of what it does for people. I think that's it's one way to think about it. And certainly when I studied community gardens, I was really interested in the way in which I thought community gardens might be facilitating social cohesion that, strangers who lived near each other could then use to put pressure on, local supervisors, right? That by the way, didn't really happen in the gardens I studied, but that was my dream. I've gotten a lot less interested in people in doing this project, in the sense that for kind of living well together in cities, part of that is human relationships with other humans, but a lot of that is also things like heat islands, which don't have much to do with my relationship with you, Gilad, and have a lot to do with the amount of vegetation cover and a decrease in the amount of asphalt. So I'm pretty sympathetic in anything that will, say, decrease heat islands or help with stormwater drainage. On the other hand, LEED certifications, like any kind of human. Have you ever read the book Sorting Things Out? Classification and Its Consequences? I'm sure the LEED certification process contains all kinds of compromises and kind of invisible work about kind of what gets valued and what gets rewarded in that particular classification system. So I'm not inclined to kind of hold on to it too much as a savior of us all, right? Yes. Oh, sorry.
Serious attempt I can think of to do many of the kinds of things you're talking about, victory gardens.
Yes.
What can we learn from that?
Yes, I actually think it's a great example. So,
Explain Victory Gardens.
so Victory Gardens was an American response to food rationing in, I think, both World War I and World War II. And they were an attempt they were sponsored by the government, they were heavily propagandized, and the attempt was to get Americans to grow more of their own food in locally available spaces, like parks, and to depend less then on the kind of big farms that were supposed to support the war effort. And it was quite successful. Ironically, most of the Victory Gardens the Victory Garden program ended after World War II, and we went back to the big factory farm system. Recently, actually, there's been an effort to kind of republicize the Victory Garden idea, this time through much more sort of voluntary means. There's a big Victory Garden push in San Francisco.
What fraction of the food supply came from Victory Gardens at its height?
I don't remember.
How did it come apart?
Well, I don't remember the proportion. I remember reading about the proportion and thinking that it was shockingly high, that it was much more than I had really thought possible, but it wasn't 100% by any means. And I'm not going to give you a number because I just genuinely don't remember. I would argue that community gardening or sort of local gardening in the U.S. Specifically, I'm only talking about the U.S., has often been in response to kind of dramatic national pressures, wars, depressions, kind of economic instability in general. And the return of stability has often meant the disappearance of kind of home agriculture.
They have to.
It was also encouraged to return to factory farming to increase the production, right? I mean, it was part of a bid to improve the economy, was to re-centralize farming
Yes.
I mean, I don't know how that affected victory gardens. So much.
See, I mean, that's what's interesting is that, you know, as with women kind of leaving the workplace after World War II, there was a kind of systematic push to get women to return and to kind of have them be replaced by men, but victory gardens don't necessarily affect the centralized farms, yet historically they did decline. You know, I'm not going to, I could speculate wildly, but I won't about why. But you had a question, I'm sorry.
Yes, when you say you don't care that much about humans, so wouldn't it be talking about your lamp? I can probably power this lamp easily by some solar collectors on my roof. So why wouldn't it be better, instead of doing all your green spaces, to plaster everything with solar panels?
It would be. I mean, that would solve another problem, right, which is the power generation problem. But then we'd be back to the heat island problem and to the water and water drainage problem. And also, I mean, I don't want to say that humans don't matter. I would never want to give anyone the impression that humans don't matter. There are lots of great reasons why people might want to garden more. But, you know, I also don't want to say that it's only or always just about kind of creating warm human relationships. Oops. Let's see if I can get us back to the, oh, that's not what there we are. There we are. So some of this are kind of human relationships issues, let's say, and kind of psychological and health issues. And some, you could argue that this is kind of a sort of classic quality of life issues, dealing with street noise. And, you know, and to a certain extent, all of this is about making the world better for us, humans. But, you know, wildlife protection and you know, these three don't necessarily involve the active participation of humans, but they do make our lives better.
Time for one more question. Thank you very much.
Thank all of you.